Hey everyone, today's video is an interview with Dr. Bart Ehrman. He's a scholar of early Christianity and a professor of religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm helping to get the word out about an upcoming live debate between Dr. Ehrman and another scholar of the New Testament, Dr. Mike Licona. The topic is, did the resurrection of Jesus really happen? It's on April 9th, and get this, it's between 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. U.S. East Coast time. So if you're counting the hours, that is a 7-hour long debate. So if you'd like to register, please head on over to bartehrman.com/Easter debate. The link is in the description below. Registering also includes lifetime access to the event recording. So again, that's bartehrman.com/Easter debate. Thanks, everyone. So I'm here with Dr. Bart Ehrman. He's a New Testament scholar, a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. Welcome back to Religion for Breakfast.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, no problem. So you have an upcoming debate with Dr. Mike Licona, who's a scholar of New Testament, a professor at Houston Baptist University, on the topic of, did the resurrection really happen? And the thing that really stood out to me is it's 7 hours long. Is this correct?
That is correct. There is a lunch break.
Okay, I hope so. I mean, this is like the filibuster of debates. You're just going to be there. Like I try to live stream on Religion for Breakfast, and I lose my voice after 1 hour. So kudos to you and Dr. Licona for a 7-hour debate. That's wild.
Well, it's kind of wild, but I'll tell you, the problem is usually when you have these debates, I've done a lot of these debates, and they're always really frustrating. And in part, they're frustrating because, you say your 20-minute thing, then the other guy says his 20-minute things, then you refute him for 10 minutes, then he refutes you for 10 minutes, and then somebody asks a question, then you go home. It's like there's no substance. You can't really get into anything. And Mike and I have profound differences and disagreements about the New Testament, about the reliability of the Gospels, about the Gospels as historical sources, and about whether it is plausible for historians even to bring up the category of miracle. And so these are very fundamental things that have a big impact, obviously, on Christianity. And in this debate, we'll be able to actually to get into these things in more illuminating detail.
Yeah, and the resurrection being like the central event for Christianity, like.
Yeah, well, if there's no resurrection, I mean, if Jesus died on the cross and then, he stayed dead, he would have been like all the other prophets who, came to a bad ending. But, there wouldn't be 2 billion people in the world worshiping him now. And so it's a rather significant deal. So that's why it deserves a little bit of time.
Yeah. So I want to get into the sources that we're dealing with the topic of the resurrection. And I want to kind of go in chronological order. I think a lot of people think about the Gospels, but, the Apostle Paul is an earlier source. So what sources are we talking about when it comes, like, when did Paul talk about the resurrection? Which letters does it come up? And what did Paul think happened with the resurrection? What's his understanding of the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, no, it is important to realize that Paul's before the Gospels because you read the Gospels first and you just kind of think the life of Jesus is before anything else. But Paul, in fact, is chronologically first. He's our earliest Christian source. And his first book was almost certainly First Thessalonians, is the first one that we have that he wrote. And the resurrection is completely central to First Thessalonians and, in fact, to all of Paul's letters. First Thessalonians, that's the first piece of Christian literature of any kind that we have is First Thessalonians, and the resurrection's everything, really, in a sense. So Paul, of course, was not a follower of Jesus during his life. He was an opponent of Christians when he first heard about them, but he claims that he had a vision of Jesus that convinced him he had been raised from the dead. And Paul explicitly says that he saw Jesus alive. This would have been about 3, maybe 4 years after Jesus' death. And so Paul was convinced that Jesus was alive because he saw him. And Paul says that the other disciples of Jesus and many other people saw Jesus alive afterwards. And so he's our first source of information. And he confirms that Jesus appeared to people. He says nothing about there being a tomb empty, but, presumably he thought there would, I guess. I don't know. He didn't say.
So I want to focus in on 1 Corinthians because this has one of the most wild passages in the entire New Testament, something that fascinated me in graduate school. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he kind of, intellectualizes what he thinks a resurrected body is like, what kind of happens physically. And he kind of talks about, I think he says specifically, there are different types of bodies. There's one for animals, one for humans. There's earthly and heavenly bodies. what is he talking about? And anybody in the audience who has not read 1 Corinthians 15, please go read it. It's
Yeah,
wild.
please read it. And the problem is that it's one of the most misunderstood passages of the entire Bible, because it's so easy to misread it, precisely because people have trouble figuring out what he's talking about, and the solutions they come up with usually are not really quite right, I think. So Paul, the situation that Paul's dealing with is that he's writing to a group of Christians who are denying that there's going to be a future resurrection of Christians, that Christians are going to be physically raised from the dead. The idea of a physical resurrection was a Jewish idea that had started out a couple hundred years before Jesus. And the idea was that if God is just and his righteous people suffer now and they die, there must be some kind of benefit in the long run. And in Jewish thinking, there isn't, traditional Jewish thinking, there's not a separation between your body and your soul. And so they couldn't come up with the idea that your soul would be rewarded when your body dies, because the human being is one thing. It's a body and soul together. And so the solution they came up with is that the body will be raised from the dead. Your spirit is the breath of life that God breathes into it, just like he breathed into Adam to make him alive. We all have the breath of God in us. And when we stop breathing, we're dead. But God will breathe back into everybody, and everybody will rise from the dead. Paul's opponents in Corinth, they were Christians, but they weren't raised in Jewish circles. They were raised in pagan circles, where there was a separation of body and soul. And so they thought this idea of the body coming back to life was ludicrous. I got to live in this thing the rest of for eternity? What? It can't be that. And so they were saying that there's not a physical resurrection of the body. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, tries to show them there has to be a physical resurrection of the body, because Jesus was physically raised from the dead. He was actually raised from the dead. It wasn't that his soul lived on afterwards like everyone else. He was brought back to life. But the problem then is, of course, how does a body live forever? We get old and we die. So what Paul argues is that there are different kinds of bodies. Our bodies are made of kind of material stuff that is really kind of coarse material stuff. But there are other kinds of quantities, other kinds of things in the world. There are spirits, for example. For Paul, spirit is not something that is what we think of as something non-material. It actually is made of stuff. Spirit is made of stuff, but it's much more refined stuff that is much and is indestructible stuff. And what Paul argues is that when Jesus was raised bodily, his actual body did come back to life, but it was transformed into a spiritual body, a body made of spirit rather than body made of this coarse matter we're now made of. So it looked like his body, and it was his body, but now it's transformed. And so he's made into an immortal body. And that's what the resurrection will be like. We'll be raised in immortal bodies. And so the analogy he uses, I think a really great analogy he uses, is that it's like a seed. You plant it in the ground, and what grows out of it is a bush. So it's like, the way I illustrate with my students is, you take an acorn and you put it in the ground, and something grows out of it, but it doesn't grow into a big acorn. It grows into an oak tree. And that's the kind of glory. Your body will be from your body, but it'll be a transformed body.
Yeah. And I feel like we see some debate over what different Christians thought about the resurrection. They had different ideas. I believe in 1 John and maybe 2 John 2, there seems to be some sort of debate there too about whether he rose again in the flesh. They keep using that word flesh. Does that point to like diversity of thought around this idea?
Yeah, there was a diversity of thought. So these Corinthians are one kind of view that that your soul, it may be that your soul lives on forever. And some people were arguing that Jesus was when Jesus was raised from the dead, it simply means that his spirit was rewarded somehow. He was spiritually raised, but that his body remained in the grave. And that's why in two of the Gospels, in Luke and in John, Luke and John go out of the way to say this was a real body that came out of the tomb, and to prove it, like Jesus has them touch his wounds or give me something to eat. He starts eating some fish, and it's like, so I guess, Jesus is raised from the dead with a digestive system and all. I don't know, but they're trying to emphasize something a little bit different from Paul. Paul's trying to say the body was transformed. And in Luke and John, it looks like it's a resuscitated body. Like it's the corpse that's just come back to life rather than something that's been renewed and transformed. So there are different views, and there continue to be different views throughout the history of Christianity. In the second century, we have all sorts of various groups of Gnostics, for example, that had different views still, and so yeah, different views.
So since we broached the topic of the Gospels already, I want to try to dial forward a few decades from Paul to the era of Mark, Luke, Matthew, John. I would like to start with Mark because this is an interesting case. There's the shorter ending of Mark, and then there's the so-called longer ending of Mark. The vast majority of scholars believe that Mark kind of ends kind of suddenly, where the women see the empty tomb and then they run away because they're afraid. And then later manuscripts have this longer section that has Jesus, doing stuff, resurrected. What do you make of that? Like, why not have Jesus walking around in the original copy of Mark and just have it end like mysteriously with this empty tomb?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a long story. It would take our entire interview to get because it's a really, really interesting point, and question. A lot of people who know about this problem, some lay people will say, "Oh, so in Mark, Jesus was not Jesus. There's no resurrection in Mark." They'll say, and that's not true. There is a resurrection in Mark. The women go to the tomb on the third day. Jesus is not there. There's a young man there who says, "You're looking for Jesus. He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. And go tell Peter and the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee." And so the women are commissioned, go tell Peter and the disciples to go meet him. And then the last line is, and they fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. It's like, what? They didn't tell the disciples. All of that fits into the whole scheme of Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, nobody can figure out who Jesus is. They don't believe him when he says he's going to die and rise from the dead. And his disciples don't understand him in the Gospel of Mark. And at the end, they still don't understand him. And so that's why it ends. But then scribes got to that last part, and they saw the women didn't tell anybody. They said, whoa, wait a second. Because they knew about narratives of Jesus showing up to people in the other Gospels. And so they added 12 verses where Jesus, the disciples do go to Galilee. They do meet Jesus. Jesus talks to them. He says to go make disciples of all the nations and baptize everyone. And he says, anyone who believes in me will be able to drink poison and not be harmed. They'll be able to handle deadly snakes. And so this is why people in my part of the world, you have Appalachian snake handlers because of these verses, which weren't originally in the Bible, by the way. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So let's compare it to Luke, Matthew, and John. So what you mentioned that the resurrection, at least in Luke and John, are referring to a resuscitated body, and like John goes out of the way to have Jesus eat fish on the beach. Thomas touch the wounds to try to convince him. So what's going on there?
I think that this is, I think John is doing this in order to argue against the idea that it wasn't a real bodily resurrection. John wants to emphasize that Jesus was the Word that became flesh. At the very beginning of John, he makes this point. Christ is this pre-existent divine being that actually became flesh. But then when he rose from the dead, he rose in the flesh. And so he returns to heaven as a fleshly being. This is John's theology. This is what John thought, but he wants to prove it by having Jesus, physically there in a way that is demonstrable.
So I want to transition to the topic of the early Christian literature, specifically the Gospels, as somehow different or exceptional in the landscape of Greco-Roman literature and Second Temple Judaism. I'm drawing this idea from Dr. Robin Faith Walsh, who's a professor of early Christianity at the University of Miami. She recently published a book that kind of pushes against the whole field of biblical studies that has long viewed the Gospels as somehow exceptional. And I think by that she means incomparable to other literature. I mean, there's no doubt that they're interesting ancient texts, but they seem to have been handled differently by biblical scholars. The whole idea of like focusing specifically on the 27 books of the New Testament and not at the other texts that are not in the canon. So somehow viewing them as divorced or floating above the culture that produced them. So I would like to get your opinion on that. Like, on one hand, do you view the Gospels as somehow exceptional or incomparable? And secondly, what's your read on how scholars and the public in general has kind of privileged these texts without comparing the ideas that show up in other texts outside of the canon?
I think that was true for most of Christian history. Um, I don't agree that that's the view. I'm not going to engage precisely with her argument, but it's certainly not true that scholars have been doing that for the. I mean, since I started teaching in the 1980s, I've argued that the Gospels are actually very much like certain kinds of Greek and Roman literature. Um, and Mike Licona, whom I'm debating, actually has a whole book on this, where he argues that in fact these books have to be treated like Greco-Roman biographies. Mike didn't come up with that idea. We've been talking about that for a long time. The Gospels have been treated as exceptional by were treated as exceptional by New Testament scholars really up to the 50s or 1960s almost. But then people started realizing, this is an attempt to tell the births in two of the Gospels, the life, the teachings, the miraculous deeds, the death, and the ascension of Jesus. And we have other books like that in the Greek and Roman worlds. And you certainly have parallels to most all of that in the Hebrew Bible, not always with one person, but you've got, all of this stuff going on and you get it. And so, when I teach my classes, I try to show that in fact, you have other religious figures in the Greek and Roman worlds who are portrayed like this, who have supernatural births, who are wunderkind, when they're young, when they can do miracles, they can cast out demons, they can raise the dead, they can heal the sick, and they ascend to heaven when they die. And so, if you're going to understand the Gospels, you can't treat them as somehow sui generis. They are part of the literature of their day, and it always surprises my students because I have them read these other accounts that were written before the Gospels. I say, so how do you explain that? Oh my God, I never heard that before. Yeah, they don't exactly teach it in church usually. But so I think you do have to treat these in their own context. But Christian scholars have long thought, these are the Gospels, and there can't be anything like them. Just like the Book of Revelation, like there's nothing like that. If you just look around, yes, there is, in fact.
Yeah, I think. So it's getting at this idea that the resurrection is somehow, unique. When I think the gospel writers, the Apostle Paul, are drawing from their cultural moment where this idea of a resurrection is already floating around.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, what I would say is that everything is unique, and so it isn't that like the Gospels are just like everything else, or that the resurrection is just like but you get similar things that are molded according to their own context, just like the Gospel stories are molded to their contexts. What is different about the Gospel stories of the resurrection from most of the other accounts we have is that the other accounts don't have they don't really have somebody who actually a human being who dies, who then is brought back from the dead and taken up into heaven. What they typically have is, for example, in Livy's account of Romulus. Romulus doesn't die, but he does ascend to heaven. Or if you get something like Julius Caesar, being taken up into heaven, he does die, but he doesn't come back to life and then go to heaven. And so the Gospels are different because they're being told out of a Jewish framework where life after death, if it exists, has to be in the body. And these other sources aren't written in those Jewish contexts. And so it's not the same. Where you do have something like that, the body, being eternal life in the body, I guess would be, in the Old Testament, of course, you get Elijah going up, but he doesn't die. So you have to say, but so that's the situation with these Gospels. They're dealing with a historical figure who did die. And everybody knew he died, but they're saying that he went up to heaven. And so it's taking the kind of the martyr narratives you get in a lot of different circles in antiquity, especially in Jewish circles, and you take the ascension narrative you get in other circles, and you put them together, and you get what becomes the resurrection then.
Yeah, which I find so interesting. I feel like there's this knee-jerk reaction, at least in YouTube discourse, to focus on like Greek and Roman influence on these ideas when they're really drawing from Second Temple Judaism as well.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's all based on resurrection motifs that you get as far back as the book of Daniel. But within Jewish circles of the time, it's all about resurrection. It's not about, it's not what you get in the Greek and Roman circles at all, because pagans had a very different view. Pagans thought it was repulsive to think that the body would come back to life again. What? Yeah.
So I want to make a little bit of a change here to this is more of a meta discussion, but I think the audience of Religion for Breakfast is hungry for this type of conversation, which is this idea of that you're having a debate with Dr. Licona. It's debating the historicity of the resurrection. This is not something that I really talk about on Religion for Breakfast. Did this really happen? Vetting the possibility of miracles really happening. And a lot of it is because of, my training. I'm kind of in the line of a great religious studies sociologist, Dr. Peter Berger, who in his book, The Sacred Canopy, says that religious studies scholars should operate under what he calls methodological atheism. Now, by that, he did not mean you must be an atheist to study religion. He himself was Lutheran, I believe. He was a Christian, but he's like methodological atheism or methodological agnosticism, which by that he meant, limiting yourself to what is empirically available. So, there's been no medical study showing somebody that has died coming to life. So therefore we should just stick with the empirically available facts, which is these texts exist and they talk about Jesus coming back to life, which is a very different kind of view. So how do you view this idea of methodological agnosticism or atheism when approaching an ancient text? And, what are the assumptions underlying a debate? Did the resurrection really happen from like a scholarly perspective?
Well, the assumptions are going to be different depending on whether you're Michael Licona or Bart Ehrman, because my assumptions are Peter Berger's assumptions. So I think people have trouble getting their minds around how scholarship has developed since the Enlightenment in ways that has made advances possible. Not just in sociology, which is Berger's field, or in the social sciences, but in the sciences themselves. Why didn't people before the 18th century develop the kind of scientific views that led us to put a person on the moon, or that made my dishwasher, or that that like allowed me to go to the dentist without? I mean, how did these advances happen? They happened when scientists decided that they were not going to try to understand everything in light of their philosophical and religious perspectives. They were going to see what happened in the world. And when they saw what happened in the world, they're going to just bracket why it happened that way. They're just going to see what happened, and is based on empirical observation. And this goes back to like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and stuff. It's like, once you do that, I mean, Newton was perfectly well a Christian, but his Christianity had nothing to do with his law of gravity. He observed things. Well, historians started developing the same mindset at the same time. We're going to bracket what we personally believe. We're just going to try and figure out what happened based on the empirical evidence. And once they did that, they made great leaps in understanding the past. Somebody who has a Christian worldview and insists that Christianity is the exception to the rule is breaking the rule. Even if you are a Christian, if you're going to do history, you bracket your faith commitments in order to study the past. And so it's, all the time I get accused of having an anti-supernaturalist bias because, you don't allow for miracles. And it is not an anti-supernaturalist bias. It's how the discipline works. There are millions of historians, and many of them in this country, and many of them are Christian. But when they do history, they don't import their beliefs into it. You cannot have a resurrection without there being a miracle, which means that God intervened in history. And there's no historian on the planet who's a bona fide historian who talks about God intervening in history. It just doesn't happen. But try convincing somebody of that. Well, look, if it's in the past, you can prove it. And so, if God did it, I'm going to show it. And so that's my position. You can show what happened in the past. And he will sometimes be a little bit coy about it. He'll say, well, I'm not saying God did it. I'm not explaining why. I'm just saying it happened that Jesus is raised from the dead. And you say, well, was it a near-death experience? Oh, no, he was really. What are you talking about if it's not a miracle? Just tell me what you're talking about. If you say it's not God, then what do you think it was? Well, I don't know. Just Jesus lives forever. Good for him.
Yeah, and I want to complicate this a little bit because many of our colleagues, some of the greatest scholars today studying early Christianity are practicing Christians. A lot of the greatest scholars today of Second Temple Judaism are practicing Jews. And I've actually found that a lot of scholars of contemporary paganism happen to be contemporary pagans as well. So I don't want this to be too simplistic. So what do you make of that with, practicing Christians being excellent scholars? Their faith commitment doesn't necessarily negate their scholarship.
Yeah. Well, just to do the analogy with science again, I mean, if you're a chemist or a physicist, it doesn't matter whether you're in China or in Iraq or in Canada or in Peru. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your nationality is, what your faith commitments are, what your philosophy is. If you're doing science, your chemistry is chemistry. It's not based on whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. It's just, there's not Muslim chemistry. There's just chemistry. And real historians try to think of it that way with history too. There's not Christian history and Jewish. I mean, there's history about Christianity, history about, there's not different methods. And so historiography is a major field of research. People study, how do you study the past? And there are, of course, disputes about it. And there are different schools of historiography. But there are not schools that say, outside of people who insist on pushing their own faith commitments, there are not like schools of history that say, oh yeah, that's one of the valid approaches, that everything has to agree with the Christian faith, everything has to agree with the Muslim faith. And so bracketing means you look at what you can demonstrate as having happened on the past based on criteria that other historians agree on. And so you analyze the data apart from requiring somebody to have your faith commitment to agree with your analysis. And that's just what it means to do history, just as it's what it means to do physics or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that view. One of the things I try to hammer here on Religion for Breakfast is that it doesn't matter if you're Hindu or Buddhist or Christian or atheist. Everybody can do religious studies, just like how you said there's not like Muslim chemistry or Hindu, paleontology. Like, it's a field with a methodology, and you can approach the subject with that methodology despite the commitments.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And I think that trying to prove the resurrection is a violation of that, because you can't have a resurrection without a faith commitment.
We're coming up against time, so let's end with that. One more plug for your debate. So it's coming up on April 9th. It's at 9:30 a.m. all the way to 4:30 p.m. Click the link in the description below. I'm also pinning the link in the comments below if you'd like to sign up. Dr. Ehrman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.